The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
My name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. Lovely to see you all today, and it's my real pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Lucy Neave. Lucy is the author of the forthcoming monograph, Infrastructures of Crisis in Global 21st Century Literature from the University of Edinburgh Press, and her most recent novel, Believe in Me, won the ACT Book of the Year in 2021. It's a wonderful novel, highly recommend it. Lucy teaches English and creative writing at the ANU, and she's here to speak to us today on the topic of technology, pandemic, and art in Ali Smith's Summer and Companion Piece. Please join me in welcoming her.
Huge thanks for the invitation. This is a really lovely opportunity for me to present something that's, everyone always says this is a total work in progress. I really appreciate all feedback on what I'm presenting. I do want to just acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, which is a land with a long tradition of conversations and dialogue and pedagogy, teaching and learning. So I just, want to pay respects to all Indigenous people here today from Ngunnawal, Ngambri country, or from elsewhere, and to elders past and present. This is kind of a pilot paper for a future fellowship application that I'm working on. And so that's partly why I'm really interested in the feedback. It's partly come out of the work I was doing for this book, as well as some of my creative work and my kind of immersion in trying to do creative practice. I'm not sure about, I chose the image. This is a sort of an aside. I chose the image for the front cover without kind of realizing how shocking it is. I think it is. Well, you can tell me if it's shocking. But the premise or the monograph's really about how contemporary novels and screen products about global crises engage with all this sort of public discourse and the media about global crises like Chernobyl, for example. And they represent what I call infrastructures of crisis as a way of revisiting and reimagining catastrophic events. So most authors of cultural products discussed in this book have made explicit statements about a catastrophic event or about the relevance of the arts and writing for making sense of really difficult events like environmental crises, for example, even if they're not entirely optimistic about their creative work having a sort of political impact. In their engagement with publicly declared crises, literary texts, I think, and also, other things like films and so on, contest this idea of the literary text being in some sort of decline. And by revisiting real-world crises, cultural products allow for a sort of re-engagement with governmental and institutional power structures, and also make a claim for their own continuing relevance. And I argue that there's this sort of political impulses in a lot of these novels that I discuss, which are, in the table of contents, or, such as Buru's Bachani's No Friend But the Mountains, which is a really complex, fantastic book, which is memoir, but also has lines of poetry and so on in it. And that these political impulses emerge from and generated by text atmospheres, moods, and gestures, even if they're not able to make political change immediately. So the book draws connections between the chronic, ongoing lived experience of crisis and built and digital infrastructures. And to my mind, it provides a model for rethinking the political in relation to this kind of ubiquitous conception of crisis, which the book critiques, just as a lot of these books are sort of critiquing this idea of crisis and saying that really crisis is a kind of chronic experience, not a turning point as it's been conventionally conceptualized. This paper was partly inspired by some of the work I did on the refugee crisis and also the pandemic, because in both of those, around those events, the use of digital devices and infrastructures was really key. So I've always regarded, smartphones as the bane of my existence. But of course, refugees trying to cross the Mediterranean or cross into Syria were really reliant on social media and also on using their phones. And this is something that's taken up in some of the literary texts. So in both, mostly in the Hamid, actually, in Exit West. And in the books about the pandemic, especially the books by Ali Smith, which are the case studies for this paper, there is a real interest in looking at technological devices and kind of what they're doing to us, and especially in relation, but they're treated somewhat equivocally in the book, the novels, as I'll get to. But at the same time, I guess they're also just interested in how the pandemic accelerated and intensified the virtual and people's engagement with virtual spaces, which I think we can probably all agree that because of some aspects of the pandemic, like, having to move to Zoom and so on, it was almost as if it was hard to resist this kind of shift to the virtual. I guess my main argument is, what came of this work, especially the work I did in chapters 2 and 3, was this evocation of digital infrastructures in literary texts. And what I would argue is that the literary field has undergone extensive and relentless change since the late 20th century. So book publishing in the late 20th century, there was a kind of large media corporations took over publishing houses, little independent publishing houses. There was this big sort of conglomeration. And then book publishing went digital in the 1990s. And I guess I've just posted this picture of the French literary field during the German occupation. And if you think about what the literary field, and I guess I'm thinking more about novels, how it shifted since then. I couldn't draw a map of it, but there's just been this massive shift towards, in like two really obvious areas, I would say. One is around the fact that self-publishing's become a lot easier and is digital and is immediate. So of course, you could do self-publishing, vanity publishing in the 20th century, but now you can do it through Amazon, and there's a I don't fully understand the process, but it's not hard. And the other big shift is around sort of branding of authors, and again in novel publishing, this idea that you have to have a public persona, which was something that publishers were always interested in. I wouldn't say have to, because I'm not very good at it, but publishers strongly encourage this kind of personal interaction between the author and the audience. And in addition to that, there's ideas around, social media use and so on for authors. So there's been a big shift in how the novel sort of publishing and publicity has occurred. And of course, there's just been this ceaseless and paradigm shifting developments in devices and infrastructures such as social media, smartphones, virtual reality, large language models, which are having this disruptive effect, as we know, if we're teaching in higher education, on institutions and on the media, politics, and the arts. So some of these concerns, and also this concern about the status of the literary text, is in a state of flux, and is in that the text is increasingly separated from its source, in that, texts are used to train generative AI. And what I'm looking at in this paper is both how these concerns are taken up in contemporary fiction, so in literary fiction, but also the kind of wider ecology that's changed for writers of fiction in the last 25 years. The approach of authors of contemporary novels to technological change in the West is complex, and I would argue include embracing technology and also resisting it. So this paper's aim is to develop a methodology for examining how writers are responding to these changes in the literary field. And as a case studies, I'm looking at Summer and Companion Piece by Ali Smith, which were written during the pandemic, since the pandemic accelerated this embrace of the virtual, culminating in online shopping, meetings, dates, education, healthcare. So I'm trying to analyze how technology is represented in Summer, and and also how it's represented, how summer itself circulates and is and sort of is taken up by readers both through traditional media. So novelists and publishers still employ traditional media such as newspaper articles and author appearances and interviews, as well as social media and online to amplify a book's audience. In thinking about how media are used by publishers and authors, it's also worth thinking about the kind of maelstrom of media in which we are embedded, the fact that we live in this kind of loud space. I mean, to an extent, you can kind of turn it off if you want, like you can not have social media accounts and that helps. But depending on individual proclivities, there's sort of social media, traditional media, various claims of books, TV, films, YouTube. So Smith, while herself a producer of what I'm calling epitext, like all of these little articles that she writes around the time that a book comes out, is arguably not an ideal case study, since she only gives the reader, she mostly just works on traditional media, such as and writes articles for The Guardian and New Statesman. And from what I can tell, doesn't appear to have a marked online presence that she's orchestrated herself. But her novels are the subject of thousands of hits on, say, Book Talk, discussions on Goodreads, and social media. So I guess what I'm trying to argue is that contemporary authors, publishers, and readers work to build this sort of virtual world around a book, which facilitates a reader's entry into the text and into texts that prepare readers for that text. Writers may resist or critique technological infrastructures and devices, as is the case in a kind of nuanced fashion in Smith's books. Their complex responses can be examined in both the books that authors write and also in the epitext, the books that they write around the book. So this paper examines the extent to which social media and discussions on Goodreads provide a kind of legitimate entry point in Smith's novels, because this kind of larger ecology has ramifications for, I guess, on a really obvious point about Smith's books is they're super political. She's talking about the refugee crisis. She's talking about Brexit. She's talking in the novels, the characters discuss an serious environmental issues. And yet, if you look at a lot of the material about the book on social media, in the ecologies that publishers and readers have created together, a lot of this stuff is just really swept under the carpet, and there's not much political discussion of her books, which I'll get to later. So it has all of these ramifications. So just to sort of have a look at some of the scholarship about the world we live in a really broad sense. In Thumbelina, The Culture and Technology of Millennials, Serres analyzes the extent of what is called in some circles the technological revolution. And I think when I read this book, it struck me some of the things that Serres says, because it's very obvious if you're teaching how much, and you've been teaching for quite a long time, how much students have changed, or their attitudes in a sense have changed over a period. And this has included a rapid and almost complete estrangement from pastoral practices, or sort of from being with the land, which has happened over maybe 100 years, to encompass changes in life expectancy, a much more marked cultural heterogeneity, thank goodness, and an education that some would argue is formatted by the media and advertising rather than by the kind of formal education that some of us are accustomed to, experienced ourselves. And also an inhabiting of the virtual, and access to knowledge that's made possible by digital devices and infrastructures, such that knowledge is no longer embodied, but is now distributed, networked, and available via smartphones, via laptops, etc. With the rapid nature of these changes, the literary text has become, in the words of John Guillory, less central to the sphere of cultural production and consumption. But at the same time, literary texts like the novel and the poem are really flexible forms and always undergoing rebirth. And you can see the quotation from Peter Boxall on the screen, where he's arguing that the novel not only gives the reader the most intimate access to the minds of others, but in the process enables us to build collective life worlds. So the novel evokes the private and the communal, and the form has this ability to decouple itself from convention, which renders the novel able to capture both kind of intimate experience and also common experience in a world that's undergoing rapid technological and anthropogenic change. So according to Boxall, as you've read probably in the quote, the novel's genetics, or this is the claim, facilitate its surpassing of existing conventions, making some novels able to exceed and reimagine the culture in which they were conceived. So you know, there's always been this long discussion about whether the novel is dead or not, and Boxall's arguing that it's not. It's also important to note that the technological inaugurates altered spaces. So Michael Salter points to the relevance of imagined worlds in the 21st century as emerging not solely from writers, but from readers, and as foundational for contemporary virtual reality. As many of you might know, that, you know, virtual reality was something that was imagined in a Huxley novel long before it was brought into reality, you know, before the devices and infrastructures existed. So while in 2025, virtual reality involves special goggles or head-mounted displays, along with haptic gloves, to venture inside a computer-generated world that convincingly mimics our physical world, giving a sense of being there, there's sort of certain virtual realities existed beyond that, including what Saylor argues is a ubiquity of references to fictional texts in the 20th and 21st century. I guess what Saylor is trying to say is that he thinks, and I'm not sure, I'm still thinking about whether I totally agree with him, that now we live in a world that's more virtual or more imagined than people did perhaps in the 19th century. And he cites 21st century online web pages and discussion groups dedicated to innumerable fiction creations, from Jane Austen to Austin Powers, and argues that adults devote a considerable attention to these kind of worlds that are not real, to a quote profusion of fictions. And that in this collective fixation on the fictional and on the worlds created, especially in the case of genre fiction and fantasy, Saylor sees a transformation of an imagined world, which fiction has always provided, into a virtual one. So he argues that essentially we've sort of, the way we view worlds has shifted in the last 100 to 150 years, such that virtual worlds, that a lot of people live in these worlds that are made up of kind of fantastic creatures and characters. And I'm not sure if I entirely agree with him, but I think it's an interesting argument. It's kind of useful for what I'm trying to say, I suppose, that which is ultimately that a lot of these epitexts, these things that writers write, and also a lot of the social media material, is helping readers to enter this kind of virtual space of books. So such virtual worlds in the early 20th century emerged by letters pages to pulp magazines and clubs and conventions. And it is easy to see that some of these spaces have expanded in more recent times to social media, to Goodreads, to social media groups and so on, that are dedicated to particular texts and spaces these texts inaugurate. So much of the fiction and groups Saylor investigates are based in genre and speculative fiction, but I would argue that a lot of, you know, publishers who are publishing stuff that's perhaps aimed at a kind of middle class bourgeois market that is more literary, arguably, they're also trying to create these worlds in which give readers a kind of way into the text, given that readers are inhabiting this kind of whirlwind of media, in a sense. As case studies, as I said before, I'm looking at Ali Smith's Summer and companion piece. Summer was written contemporaneously with the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. So Ali Smith was interested in writing these seasonal books. That this is the fourth in the quartet, in which she was basically writing them very quickly, and they were published within months of having been finished. And they were about events that were happening largely in the UK at the time she was writing. So Summer starts with the mention of the Australian bushfires in 2020, and sort of encompasses what happens in the early pandemic in the UK. And then companion piece, which is not strictly part of the quartet, but is a book that's supposed to be read as a companion, was published in 2022 and is more about the later phases of the pandemic. I'm mostly talking about Summer just because, you know, otherwise I'll just go on for too long. So I think what's interesting about these books is that they underline the importance of art forms such as writing, sculpture, and theatre in the course of Summer, in the case of Summer, and painting in companion piece. Both books, in part due to the time that they were published, represent the kind of technological advances that are every day. But I guess to a large extent that a lot of contemporary literary fiction that likes to pretend that sometimes likes to pretend, not always, that these things aren't sort of an important part of everyday life. But it's interesting also that technologies from earlier eras play an important symbolic role in both books. So an egg timer is crucial in Summer as a way of referencing time, while a craftsperson made lock and key from the 16th century is vital as a metaphor for literary critique in Companion Piece. But while also kind of the lock and key idea is also a metaphor for a relationship between the literary text and the reader. Summer and Companion, so they're interested in depicting not just new technology, but kind of old technology, which I'm probably not going to go into much, but it's just an interesting aspect of the novels. But they're really interested in showing the effects of new communication and media technologies on human characters, which are predominantly, but not only, evoked as contributing to fragmentation and social disconnection, in contrast to real life artworks, which in both books mostly bring people together. Scholarship on Summer observes the novel's interest in power and powerlessness of language, in crises and backlashes in English politics. I think I've talked about that a bit already. In Summer, Sasha and her mother argue early in the novel because Sasha's around 16. She's writing an essay for school and she wants to use a quotation, "Forgiveness is the only way to reverse the irreversible flow of history." Sasha claims the quote source is Brainy quote, while her mother, Grace Greenlaw, says that she can't put down Brainy quote as the source, that Sasha needs to cite the original text. Otherwise, it's not, quote, trustworthy. Sasha views her mother's concerns as a displacement activity from worrying about the real things happening in the world, aka climate change, which Sasha is deeply concerned about. But in Summer's evocation of phrases and texts unanchored from their sources, so Sasha in the process shows her mother a list of sites, Brainy quote, quote part, quoted, as quotes, Goodreads, which include Arendt's quote without its original source. It also references the giant text repository that is the internet, a sort of melange of words, which, although this isn't a feature of the novel, has been used to feed and train large language models. Summer presents a world where, as Sarah says, knowledge is externalized, disembodied, fragmented. It poses a question about what that means. In the conversation between Sasha and her mother, does it matter, quote, if nobody said it in any original source and someone somewhere just made up that Hannah Arendt said it, typed it into the net and then spread it through all these sites? The irony in this scene is underscored by the fact that while Grace Greenlaw is urging her daughter to find the source for a quotation in her essay, at the same time, she maunders around repeating the sentence, "Whether I shall turn out to be the heroine of my own life," an amended line from Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, a line spoken in a play adaptation in which Grace appeared decades earlier, whose source she's forgotten. But as she's saying the words and she's remembering the words, she refuses to allow Sasha to look up where the quotes come from. In this way, the text is not only this kind of melange on the internet, but it's also a sort of scheme entangled in characters' heads. And I guess coming back to Serres, he argues that knowledge in the form of reference works, texts, dictionaries, is now distributed everywhere. And that cognition, which used to be inside, is now sort of externalized. It's now something that is often, you're looking at computers or smartphones to kind of maybe not to think entirely, but certainly they're used as sort of crutches. Smith's book is pointing to the problematic nature of the decontextualized text while also underlining the limits of human memory in the process. And in its contrast of the use by Sasha and her mother of text, it also highlights this sort of generational divide between them, obviously. That's in the novel, it's not bridgeable by the use of technology. Just one other example from Summer. Texting and social media are also ubiquitous in Summer as they are in real life. Melanie, a friend of Sasha's, texts about the death of Dr. Lee, who was the doctor who died early in the pandemic when he was issuing warnings about COVID. And you can see her unpunctuated text containing another much cited quote actually from Dr. Lee, which was from an interview from when he was ill with COVID, and references the spread of information about COVID as well as its effects on those distant from the location of the outbreak. While in this case, Dr. Lee is a hero, he's actually kind of the hero of his own life in a way that perhaps Grace never is. and his warnings spread via social media, this had no immediate effect on the course of the pandemic in China. Social media, while it connects Mel with a doctor who lives thousands of kilometers away, for whom she has this sort of feeling, is not actually politically or practically effective. But it's interesting to note that Lee's quote also appears to reference the internet itself, which itself certainly has more than one voice and is therefore arguably a feature of a healthy society. Summer and Companion Piece are really interested in representing time and the sense of pandemic temporality, as well as the recursive effects of memory, seasons, and the experience of previous pandemics or periods of confinement. So you could argue, and I think this is part of how Summer and Companion Piece work, is they show how how people existed in these kind of different fragmented times during the pandemic, and that in fact it's actually, to summarize really quickly, it's actually the experience of works of art that are represented as kind of reinstalling this sense of community between people. So in this particular example, of course, it's the pandemic working in concert with technology, which entails this fragmentation of time and poses a challenge to the sense of shared contemporaneous living. So artworks described in the novel work to configure a collective experience of temporality in those who participated in their construction and also in their audiences. So it's just a quote this is from About Grace and her performance of a play called The World as It Rolled, which was a sort of an interpretation of Dickens' David Copperfield. And you can see here that art is something real which happened, that Grace's performance stems in part from her channeling a vision of her mother's own long gone face, which she experiences her as entering her in the moment she said these lines. And her memory reanimates her mother and is transmuted into performance, while at the same time it sort of brings all these people to talk to her in the town and in the place. And this happens a number of times in Summer. It's not, this is one particular example, but there are other examples where people look at a sculpture together, for example, and that kind of, it bridges generational divides in ways that the internet and social media fails. So I guess there's some just examples of how technology versus art, and art has this sort of knitting effect, and technology is sort of a dispersing effect in Summer and also in Companion Piece. But to kind of come back to what Alice Smith is writing about the texts and how she directs the reading of the texts by academic audiences in this case, and also by general audiences, you can see that the epitext Smith has produced manufacture a world where her fiction is made more legible, more readable for a general audience, and also encourage academic interpretations of her work. So this is from prior to the book's publication, but you can see that while I've been talking about time briefly, this is a reading that Ali Smith herself has, to an extent, directed by writing about the novel as a form that is really engaged with questions of time. She argues that the novel's imagination and manipulation of time past, present, and future constitutes its ability to reconfigure the reader's apprehension of a particular time, of living in time, and of our time cycles. So while more recent literary critics such as Sarah Boulette contend that literature and conceptions of being a writer have been co-opted by economic and social forces to serve capitalism and ultimately insecure work, Smith maintains that writing has this ability to instantiate new senses of time or to critique commonly held views of a particular period, even if fiction's impact is not sort of quantifiable. So this quotation has been taken up a lot in the scholarship about Smith's fiction. So during the time Smith published the last volume of Quartet and Companion Piece, she also published a range of other texts, a short story in a volume about Catherine Mansfield, an obituary of a poet, a piece that came out around the time of Companion Piece about the relationship between Catherine Mansfield and Virginia Woolf, and a range of pieces in the Literary Review and New Statesman. She also made in-person appearances when possible during this period, including Why We Write, published in the European Review of Books, which is a sort of a writing back to Orwell's Why I Write. on the occasion of her having won the Orwell Prize. So her epithets contribute to a sense of her alignment with canonical women writers such as Woolf and Mansfield, and augment the cultural capital her work has accrued. She does not appear to have an author website or an Instagram account, but her publisher, Penguin Books, has amplified her social media presence, an amplification that has been taken up by her fans who have posted on BookTok about her work, where short-form videos have received thousands of hits. In this way, responses to Smith's work have culminated in the construction of these kind of virtual worlds, rather than letters pages to pulp magazines or clubs. To my knowledge, there's no Ali Smith Club. There is an expansion of space around Smith's work, partly for commercial gain and on the part of her publisher, but also partly because she has really interesting political ideas that she wants to communicate and she wants to get out to her audience. But she's mostly using traditional media to do that. BookTok posts include those by influencers such as a couple of classics and the Virgo Librarian. Most of these reviews are of the quartet, of which Summer is one volume. And it's interesting that in the BookTok, because BookTok's such a short form, Summer and companion piece are overtly political. They call attention to the treatment of refugees, the Black Lives Matter movement, environmental destruction, the effects of Brexit. The format that is BookTok allows for very little engagement with the ideas in the books. Instead, BookTokers mostly admire the quartet for its design, which you will have seen, like it's a really nice design. Although there is an appreciation for Smith's queerness and the fact that she is really out, about who she is, and the fact that the books also portray queer and non-binary characters. BookToks about Smith mostly comprise reviewers standing before bookshelves and holding up a title, like they're not especially kind of innovative in terms of their production. I was really struck by the Goodreads reviews of Ali Smith's books, though. They're like reviews, I haven't read Goodreads reviews like this for other titles. I mean, maybe I'm not fully across Goodreads reviews, but there are poems like this one on the right. And then there's also more than one reviewer posts pictures of the artworks that she references in the book in the Goodreads review, which again provides this kind of way of experiencing the book before you even get into the book and imagining the book and imagining the artworks that Smith is using. So Summer has 11,922 ratings and 1,725 reviews on Goodreads. But the form of the Goodreads review is quite capacious, so readers can write a paragraph or a review of more than 1,000 words, so that the novel's political import is more transparent on Goodreads reviews. So you can do an analysis of Goodreads reviews and just search for how many mentions of Brexit there are, for example. So there's 196 mentions of Brexit, although some of them are referencing other novels in the quartet. A few mention the environment and quite a few mention refugees, which are all concerns in the novel. So in this way, the reviews do more completely conjure the world of the book, especially its engagement with art, in a kind of tangible way. In this paper, I've sketched an approach for examining the effication of recent technological advances and how those technological advances are encoded in novels set in the 2020s, from the use of smartphones to communication devices, to the shift to the imperative for self-promotion by writers and artists. So there's a section in companion piece where the main character, who's an artist, is told by a person in their 20s that she's not an artist unless she has a website, basically. Like, you can't be an artist. It's not about doing the art. It's about like having a public persona. So there's been a rapid change in hundreds of years of writing, publishing, and talking about the object that is the book. So, I think that's what I'm kind of interested in studying this and how writers are adapting. I argue that while devices and their infrastructures are portrayed ambivalently in Summer and in companion piece, and instead it is in real life embodied forms of art that are portrayed as knitting different people together in a time marked by heterochronies. But while authors critique the effects of social media and more recently the threat posed by generative AI for their work, in the 21st century literary domain, publishers and authors work together using a mixture of traditional, in the form of the newspaper article, and new media to create what I'm terming virtual spaces for their books, attempting to provide multiple engagement points for readers in a world that's saturated with cultural products, opinion, and media. the books themselves still make nuanced and complicated cases for the importance and continued importance of literature, art, theatre, and sculpture. They contain spaces that are expansive and complex, in contrast to the brief, often apolitical online media formulated to drive the engagement with them. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lucy. I'm going to start with one, Lucy. And this is, it's a bit inchoate, but one of the
whole
things
is still like getting more co-ate, frankly, but yeah.
yeah, well, in the direction of coation, one of the phrases you used just recently was the world of the book.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that you could use a similar phrase about most any artwork, really. You know, you could talk about the world of the painting, the world of the poem.
Yeah.
Like there seems to be something about artwork where it does carry with it an implicit universe. And no matter what changes happen with social media or publicity or whatever, there's still that move from wherever we are here into the artwork.
Yeah.
Like that seems.
I'm really interested in that. Yeah, and it has been partly trying to work out, because there are multiple worlds here. Like there is the world of the artwork, but there's also the world that's created around the artwork by different media, I guess, in a sense. Yeah. Is that, sorry, that's not answering your question because you haven't quite finished, but yeah.
Well, I haven't really asked a question, but something that's intriguing me is that art never seems entirely just to bleed into the rest of the world. Like there does always seem to be, you know, something in the nature of art that demands its own space in some way, so that the publicists have to forward that in some way, but it's definitely still there. Do you see what I'm getting at?
I've been struggling to work out how to talk about it in a way that makes sense. Like there's a whole section in this paper about heterotopias as well. But I was thinking more about those sort of, you know, social media spaces as heterotopias. And I'm sort of still reading more about the heterotopia and thinking about whether it would actually work, because Foucault talks about them being real spaces and sort of, you know, cemeteries and prisons and so on. But he's writing in 1967, which is, you know, a long time before a lot of the technologies that we're talking about. Or he spoke in 1967, and then the paper on heterotopias was published later in translation. Yeah, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Lucy, I'm wondering, therefore, you're talking about all of these kinds of little worlds that are created almost adjacent to, alongside, or even before the novel. Is that separate from the world of the author, or do you think the author is part of the machine that's getting that going through? You kind of spoke a little bit about capitalism. Is that part of the expectation now on authors?
Yeah, well, I think in traditional trade publishing, yes. I think a lot of just in terms of contracts, a lot of authors sign contracts for books that say that they will do social media, or that they will do what the publisher tells them in terms of public appearances. Of course, it depends a lot on the author's capital, like cultural capital. So if you're like a winner of a Nobel Prize, you can kind of come in and give a reading and then walk out again, and they can't make you do anything. But if you are just somebody who's struggling to get your book published and then it's finally published, then I think in the fiction world, you often are co-opted, even if you don't necessarily believe in the whole capitalist machine, in doing what you can, partly because you won't get another book contract unless you sell a certain number of books. So you sort of have to play on the publisher's team. I mean, willing to hear other views on this, but yeah, or unless you go somewhere really independent where they don't care. Yeah.
And therefore, do the authors then enter into these kinds of dialogues with people who are establishing these little worlds around their book as well? Do you see? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, my experience has been, and I think it's probably the same for artists. You know, I'm like, it's really important to have an Instagram account and so on, and to interact with readers or I know, yeah. And so, yeah, I think so. And also there are various online fora. So there's I don't know, something like I did something once with my last book with the Global Women's Book Club or something, you know, like, and so that was one of those experiences where you feel like you are part, you're interacting with readers. Probably 2 people showed up, I can't remember, but
Thank you.
yeah.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for that. How can I just say, how is this research? When did you start this research? Did you start out of recently? Okay, because obviously it makes sense now with lockdown type stuff, filtering down for research, novels, things like that happening now. But how has it affected, or have you thought about how it affects your own writing as well? As it,
Yeah.
what does it mean?
You know, thinking about the sort of broader ecosystem as a writer that you're enmeshed in. So it's come partly, it's mostly, well, I was starting to think about it, I think, when I was working on the book, which I did start writing during COVID, but because I started getting interested in infrastructures and digital infrastructures and sort of being connected, how people are connected now, which is quite different to how they were connected maybe 40 years ago. Yeah. Does that make, I don't know if that answers your question. But yeah, it's but the project won't just focus on COVID, because it's just so happens that this paper is also focused on the Ali Smith books, which are very much about the pandemic and the lockdown and the kind of the big shift to kind of online forms of communication. But I'm really interested in how writers are engaging with a range of technological devices and infrastructures and how they're trying to use them. So it's also a question of trying to narrow down like what I'm actually looking at, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I was just with Rick as well. We're just saying that's really interesting because a lot of people and communities have sprung up on things like Discord, Slack, especially speculative fiction, science fiction writers. Lots of communities for writers outside of the literary field, I guess, in speculative fiction, science fiction, Discord, Slack, really interesting, quicker ways of communicating and writing, and which wouldn't be considered within, I guess, literary circles. So it's worth thinking about that as well. I think in some ways, yeah.
I think that's one thing that I haven't talked about at all in relation to this paper, and is something that I need to work out how to study, is just those communities of writers, rather than the kind of writer, publisher, writer, reader relationship. But also there's all these communities of writers, which, as you say, are communicating via Discord.
Yeah, some good stuff. Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you. That's really useful.
Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, so just mindful, this isn't a microphone, so I should speak up. But yeah, thank you, Lucy. Like, a really interesting talk. And you know, I was kind of sort of trying to reflect as you were talking about kind of what your talk was doing, right? Because on the one hand, it's an analysis of this space that publishing is in and that, you know, authorship is in, but also kind of at its heart about reception, right? Like, because you know, here you've got, you know, actual artworks, but also all of these paratexts that are being produced around them that are kind of impinging upon reception, which then made me think, is it a critique? Right, like what your argument is here, that, you know, that because coming back to, you know, some of the themes you were talking about, you know, around, I guess, kind of the crisis political themes being subsumed by all of this, is that what your argument's going to? Is that you want to critique what's going on?
Linda and I have a lot of, you know, I'd like to live in isolation from this stuff, but I think what I'm really interested in for the project, for the larger project, is working out productive ways that writers and publishers can, I don't want to say use technology, but think about or kind of intervene in how technologies are used. Because the big question, of course, is the whole AI question, the large language models question, which I don't want to get hung up on in the future fellowship, because there's been this long, I think the other way to think about it is to think, well, you know, when writing was a technology, a lot of people were very upset about that, as in writing itself. Plato said that it would ruin people's memory and, you know, and screw up all manner of things, right? And so writers have always adapted to these to technological change, I would argue. And so what is the adaptation now around these things that have happened? I don't know if does that answer your question? So although there are,
Yeah, I think so, except
there are critical aspects.
except it's not so much technology as a kind of whole infrastructure of kind of commercial publishing and kind of and the industries that surround that. So it's more than technology, right?
It's a whole field, I guess, of political and I guess social struggle. And what do you do in that space? So it is thinking more about what to do kind of proactively or together or productively in relation to that space, which doesn't mean that it's not critical to an extent, but also doesn't mean that it's Luddite, I guess, like wholly Luddite. Yeah, because it can't be.
Thank you.
But thank you, that's a good question.
Rick.
Hi, thanks for that talk. To actually just from that conversation, brought up two things. It seems to me you've got two areas. You've got the writers, that relationship between the writers, publishers, and the audience or the fandom, as in speculative fiction. And speculative fiction is actually interesting because that infrastructure, around the world of the book and around the author, that's its own industry now. It's huge. That has its own infrastructure. Something like Discord came because of that. Particularly.
I feel like I've agreed with you in sort of suggesting that it's something that what is happening in sort of literary fiction, which is its own genre, it has really followed to a large extent from what's happened in speculative fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's my sense from what I've read.
Because basically the geeks always get onto it first.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day, and also the subject matter of crisis and apocalypse. That's normal stuff for spec fic. And business as usual. It's business as usual, and it's gotten even better now. And I don't want to make life harder for you, but games, the narrative in games, that's really taken on that. And
I need to reference games. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of my speciality, so feel free to contact me later. The other thing I wanted was about the AI. My PhD's taken a weird turn recently and is now looking at steampunk and post-colonialism. And now, because I decided to make my life harder for myself, I'm looking at how AI can assist me in the creation of that product without writing it for me.
Yeah.
What can it do? What good is it? And it's been a very scary trip at the moment.
Yeah. Actually, I'm planning to do. It's kind of, I'm expecting not to get the feature fellowship. So I'm actually working with someone in Melbourne, and we're going to do a survey on AI use by creative writing, academics, but also what they're seeing in the classroom and how people are using AI. Because the thing is, a lot of people think they're not using it, but in fact, it's quite hard not to use it.
Yeah. Well, the AI and I have set up boundaries, and we've got like a charter of what it can do, what I do, what it can't do.
Interesting.
I've had 21,000 words worth of discussion with the AI since the beginning of June, where we have long, deep, meaningful discussions about all this. And it even helps me create the database to keep track of it all. But it's a very weird world because I don't want the AI to write it. I'm I'm the author. But its ability to engage and the more you kind of train it about what you're writing about, and now it knows the context of what I'm writing. So we have conversations about it, and it makes suggestions, and it's all very weird. But
Thank you.
but they
Still can't make a cup of coffee.
yeah.
Or do dishes or anything.
I wonder if the Hannah Arendt quote in the novel is a bit of a premonition of a large language learning kind of fear, like that, you know, these words might lose their significance if we can't attribute them properly, if we don't connect them with the right body of ideas. There's some weird fear there about that I share. I'm terrified of Brady quotes. Yeah. Okay, look, thank you very much, Lucy. Please join me. Thank you.